Hi, I'm Danny Black, and welcome to the @SportsBalt podcast. On this podcast, I will be talking sports cards, collectibles, memorabilia. I'll be interviewing hobby guests. I will be talking about my own thoughts. I'll cover regular sports that relate to the hobby. That's the fun part. More importantly, I want you along for the ride. So click like and follow for more content, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, hello. Welcome to another edition of SportsBalt Podcast. One of my favorite guests today, Cindy Dick from OnHerMark.com. And I usually do a big preamble, but I just want to talk to her before we run out of time because I am going to bring her in right now. Hi, Cindy. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Thanks for having me on your show.
I have been taught that the new thing in vlogging and podcasting, this is my new mantra, my 2023, I'm not going to lose weight, but nobody wants to hear more than 30 minutes. So that's my new goal. I have yet to hit it at all, so we're going to try. But just like my diets in previous years, they have failed miserably. So thank you for coming on.
Very welcome. Very welcome. Always fun to talk about vintage women's sports cards.
Well, that's what I was about to say. You're one of my favorite people because I get to talk about vintage cards. I get to talk about women's cards, vintage women's cards, and you know more than anybody in the world about what vintage women's cards. So I'm going to hit you in reverse order, and we're going to start with, depending on when you're listening to this, we're recording on the 2nd. So yesterday was Women in Sports Day, February 1st, and I want to kind of work in reverse because there's a lot of significance to that day and the history of which I think we're going to talk about in a little bit. So do you mind educating those of us that don't know all the details behind Women in Sports Day?
Sure. It started, it was kind of inspired, if you will, sadly by a tragic incidents where a volleyball player and great Flo Hyman passed away suddenly and unexpectedly mid-game during a match, and I think it was against Japan in the early 1980s. It was just after, I believe, the Olympics, and about a year after the Olympic match that she was in, that the U.S. won the silver medal. So they were doing a substitution. She sat down and she collapsed and died. And later they found out that she had Marfan syndrome. And so with that, because of her accomplishments, because of her outstanding sportsmanship, they dedicated a day kind of in her honor, and it became the National Girls and Women's Sport Day. And it's grown to a national event. It can be, hosted in any level, from community, high school, colleges put on events. The Women's Sports Foundation is a big leader in it as well. And so it's great to see the tradition continue and Flo Hyman's, memory continue as well.
It's, I don't know if it's ironic, but I thought actually when I heard the story about Damar Hamlin and, what he just went through on the football field and thinking about it, right as she came out for the substitution, if I understand the story, she was literally just sitting on the bench.
Yeah.
And went down right there. And so, if everybody can remember the fear we all felt watching the Damar Hamlin situation, imagine what that must have been like and why it was such an important time to create that honor. So thank you for sharing that. Now, I've been on other shows and we have tossed around what does vintage mean. And you can talk about in baseball cards, Fleer and Donruss sued Topps. So in 1981, it opened it up to 3 companies. So did that end an era? You have post-war and the start in 48, and did that start an era? Mm-hmm. You talk about women's vintage cards, and I'm going to put this up here because I'm probably going to get the dates exactly wrong. From 1850 to 1972. Now, I know what 1972 is because you've taught me this before, but I've never known where the 1850 came from, and if I do, then I apologize for forgetting it. So I'll show off here. 1972 was Title IX. Yep. But fill in much more of the gaps on the 1850, and then kind of why you call it vintage in 1972.
So first, I probably need to explain that that time frame is not necessarily, for me anyways, tied to a definition of vintage. It's in reference to the collection period that I focus on. And so when I first started in the 1990s, I was finding contemporary cards, and eventually I found an old one, and it just like electrified me. And after a few years, I decided I'm just going to focus my resources on anything that was printed before 1972 because of Title IX. And I think Title IX has just sent a ripple effect around the world, even though it's just a US law, around women's sports and how other nations treat women's sports. So that was my benchmark. And then I decided I'm going to find what I can as far back as I can go. And my oldest card, representing a woman playing sports is actually what they would call a trade card. So before trading cards, it was trade cards. And that's pretty much it's this era, like between the 1850s and 1888 is the first card I have. That's Hattie Stewart as an American boxer. So she's the first competitive athlete that I can find. Everything in between, they're trade cards. And honestly, I don't really specialize in it, but I was picking up some because I think it was like this important stepping stone in this lineage for girls and women to see others participating in sport, activity, recreation, however they were represented on these cards in, very stringent days of the Victorian era, where they couldn't, wear clothing that was conducive to being an athlete.
Any three pairs of pants they wanted, they were allowed to wear at the same time.
Yeah.
It was like Congress up until Barbara Mikulski. I'm from Maryland, so we're proud. Yes. Yeah. So I think it's fascinating because, first of all, I love the fact that I think that makes a perfect cutoff.
Yeah, it does. It really does.
I wish, we have such problems, but in male sports, like I said, there's not this cutoff. So 1972, you have Title IX, and Title IX, for people who are not familiar, and please correct me if I get any facts wrong, legalized the responsibility to spread financial money equally amongst all revenue-bearing sports and non-revenue-bearing sports for the first time. Am I generally correct?
Yes. It started as saying it's an anti-discrimination law in the U.S. signed by Nixon that says you cannot discriminate against one sex or the other in a federally funded educational institution. And the irony was that it was written without any word directed towards sports or athletics. It was because the discrepancies were so large and measurable. They were measurable that's when it became aligned with sport. And so it's become, in some situations, almost synonymous with sport now today, and particularly in colleges, which is my world, but it's, more aligned with gender discrimination, sexual harassment, and less aligned with sport. But it's still there, it still affects sports.
Absolutely a lazy perspective for me to phrase it like that. No, you're 100% correct. But the application to sport was so significant that, it's funny, that for certainly for 40 or 50 years, I think is what it came to be known for. And like you said,
it's
now changing, and we'll look back in 20 or 30 years differently. But we are now, and you and I were talking off camera, I think we're now just starting to see some of those dividends paid. And we were talking about super teams and the WNBA, and I'll keep thoughts of super teams and free agency separate from this conversation. But it's the conversation that we've had about the Bulls and the Heat and all these other super teams over the years in the NBA, and now we're having the exact same conversation. But this is the children of Title IX.
Yeah, and we really see it in the team sports, women's gymnastics, women's softball, women's soccer, and on the international stage, women's basketball, of course, which has pro as well. But it is interesting to see it. I was going to say snowball, but it is. It's a buildup over time. I know there's a lot of controversy about Title IX, but it really comes down to it's a financial decision if you want to cut sports or you want to raise money to be able to fund both. And there's other prongs to it. You have to have competitive opportunity. It has to do with proportions of your student body, male percentage to female percentage, et cetera. So there's a lot of prongs to it. But I think by and large, it has done wonders for both women's sports and opportunity. And then, of course, the global spreading, because nobody wants to be left behind and just beaten all the time. So, and I don't think any other country that, to my knowledge anyways, has necessarily a law like Title IX. But yeah, so that's what I used as my cutoff. And again, it just, I was finding, even in the 90s, it was easier to find contemporary cards than it was vintage. And it's way more easier today between the WNBA and soccer leagues. And of course, when the Olympics come out, and so I kind of like the challenge of finding the old gals, as I affectionately call them.
Was there and I don't know exactly when you started really collecting physically hardcore, but was there a sweet spot where you found the market and the internet was around before you had the competition you may have now for some of these cards, as you say, for the older gals?
Yeah, and even going to shows, I think the sweet spot, it was kind of probably early 2000s. I mean, now I might be up against one or two bidders, maybe even now, which is nice. It's not hot and heavy, but before there were more eyes on it, and I think the eyes are coming from the dollar signs, basically, as the Serena Williams, the Mia Hamm cards, that they're starting to get significant collectible cachet behind them. And so maybe there's this thinking that older ones will have that too. And I've never done this for the money, ever. I have some for sale, but it's not about the money. It's not my motivation. It's more about just finding what I can find. And I'm in the process of writing a book about it. But yeah, the sweet spot, sorry, rambling, but I would say that would probably be it when there was still bricks and mortar stores and shows. And you could develop relationships in person with people, because what I have found is that in the shows in particular and stores, vendors, they sell what will sell. Otherwise, they won't be in business. And so if nobody's asking for women's cards, they're not going to supply them. When I first started collecting in the 90s, oftentimes they would just give me the cards because nobody else was buying them. To them, it was literally worthless. And now,
and now it's become not worthless.
Yeah, no, they've become quite a bit more expensive along the way. What used to be $12 is now easily like $75 or something.
I was lamenting before about wanting many cards I cannot afford, men and women alike. So yes, no, yeah. Unfortunately, I missed your sweet spot. I wish I would have made better picks. I think the first time I was exposed to collecting female athletes would have been, I think it was Lisa Fernandez.
That's awful. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think because she had a game used patch and the auto. It was one of the first, it wasn't a rookie, but a patch auto card. And I remembered watching her pitch in the Olympics, and I thought the patch auto was so cool. And so she was my first card. So I always found it easier to find current cards. So
yeah.
And I collect vintage in general. So I would be open-minded. I mean, if I ever found any of my heroes, at a price I can afford, I would have bought it. I just don't see them,
It's always been a bit of a needle in a haystack with women's cards, especially, in Fernandez's era. I don't know if that's an aftermarket card or if that was during the time she played. I personally know that card, but I can picture it. And yeah, if it was during the time she played in the Olympics, it would be harder to find perhaps than today if they made an aftermarket card. But yeah, usually they're inserted with men's cards, and the women's cards are a minority unless it's their own league. So like soccer and WNBA. And it seems to be the way it has been even back in the genre that I collect.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So getting back to the vintage cards, a lot of them were done as part of advertising or part of a promotional type of product.
Yeah. All of them.
Yeah. I mean that's
Yeah.
where they're done. So I mean, I can you give the brief history of how the cards were used by corporate America?
So,
Um,
so most of them were tobacco cards. Same with men's cards, and then you've got some that were coffee or chocolate, shoe polish. You even have one from if you bought a piano, you got a trade card. But in trading cards, yeah, most of them are aligned with products, and I would say tobacco and chocolate are some of the most common. Tobacco, by and large, probably 90% of the market of my vintage cards are tobacco cards.
are alternate backs just as much of a challenge in a collector, or is it not as many alternate backs with the tobacco cards?
They don't do them like within the same maker. It's really because photography was so rare then, oftentimes different companies will use the same picture.
Right.
And so that's what I find, not a lot of, but on occasion. So totally different companies will use the same image.
Yeah. Do you have a niche that you seek specifically at this point? Like you've been doing this for a number of years. Have you, do you still have something that gets you going for the chase?
I'd say the first answer to that is any card that I haven't seen before. And so I look at before 1972. The other big caveat is it needs to be a card printed around the time the athlete actually competed, because that's a reflection of the norms at that time and not 50 years later. So
That's so great.
And then of course it being an original card. Right now, so for the book, originally it was this whole time period, 1850s to 1972, and I've been working on it so long that I just feel like this is too much to cover. I bit off way more than I can chew. And my favorite time period is the 1920s and 30s. And what we see in the collection, and also some other people that have studied other forms of women's ephemera around athleticism, is there's this peak. And so if you look at it's like a bell curve, it goes 1850s, 1900s, 1936 is like the highest point, and then after the war it just drops down, and it slowly starts to recover by the 70s, but it's nowhere near as high as the 70s in the production of these cards. So the 20s and 30s are my favorite eras, and I decided to cut off the time frame of the book shortly after World War II.
So I've got to ask, can you tell us any more about the book?
Yeah, so it's I hope it will be like a coffee table type book, but with historically accurate research. I do delve into a bit of the socioeconomic history because I think it's really important. You could see a picture of a woman competing in 1920 and maybe one today. And it's so easy to look at it from today's seat, if you will, or today's socioeconomic framework of, well, she had the same opportunities I did, and to understand that she didn't. And not only that, but, I grew up seeing sport from an American lens, which is natural. And through these cards and seeing that so many of them come out of Germany in particular, I would say Europe and UK produced way more than America ever did. As far as women's sports go in this time period. And so why? Why was that? And so I looked particularly into Germany, because they were the largest producers. And it could be athletes all over the world, or they could be German athletes. So I think I found the answer to that, and that will be in the book as well. And so it's just fascinating to see that.
That's a pro tease. I'm on the edge of my seat here. Okay, pro tease. Well done. Well done. Okay. Well, I mean, it literally sounds fascinating.
It is. It really is. It's such a fun way to look at history. It truly is.
And I know that your a history on vintage cards. A lot of men's cards are not super successful in the 20s and 30s when you get into the strip cards, and they're not as sought after. And I don't know if you've ever thought about it, if it's just a dichotomy or just the way it worked out, or because you're going international, it changes the rules. But I've talked to people and they hate 20s and 30s baseball cards. Like Dr. Beckett said, you mean the colored cartoons that don't look like anybody? Are we talking strip cards
No.
or?
No, I mean, that's a really tiny part. And they have a few strip cards of women. But yeah, it's a really tiny, tiny part of the collection. So just to give you an idea what the collection means, okay, in quantities, I literally hit 1,700 like flat even the other day of what I own. I have a database that includes another, I think it's about 600 or so of cards that I don't own, but I have, seen. I'm not a crazy collector. I don't have to have
by database, do we mean wish list?
No. I mean,
okay.
I have a database. I do have a wish list, but I do have a database. So it's the cards I own. It's the cards I've seen, don't own. Because one of the things I'd like to have in this book, and on an online version that would be searchable, is to have a concise list of what's out there. And what still surprises me after doing this for almost 30 years is I'm still finding cards I've never seen before. And that is such a fun, part of this, because gosh, the day that, it's over, so to speak, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with myself. I truly love the hunt, probably, more than anything, but I don't know what I'm hunting for. I don't know. I mean, some of it, yes, sure. I know that there's some out there that I'm still looking for, but there's a lot of them I'm finding, that I have never seen before. And when it's a real athlete, those are really the ones I get. But that's what's so exciting, is to unearth history of somebody I probably haven't seen before. And if you go to the Giant Legends Instagram page, you see a couple of the speed skaters, for example, that I knew nothing about, nor did I even know that it was an exhibition sport or demonstration sport for women in the 1932 Olympics, because speed skating didn't come along until 1960. As an official sport. So to see these gals,
in
there,
go real slow. I mean, was that?
yeah, too slow. But it was a big deal, of course, in your part of the country and in Canada, and there was all kinds of competitions, in North America, but it wasn't an Olympic sport. So to see that they actually got to compete in the Olympics and who they were, and to me that kind of history education is so much fun in this little vignette of a card.
All right, I have so many questions. Have you ever wanted, or have you ever thought about going overseas on card hunts?
Yes. So anytime I travel, I try to find places that have cards. And so I've been in the UK. I haven't gone specifically for that reason, but I always tie it together for sure. If I can.
You don't have to admit it. It's okay. We know.
Yeah, I know. Country United. Yeah.
Right.
But no, I actually have friends that would love to go with me. Like, you need to come to Geneva, Switzerland, because we could go card shopping, and I'm going to be the one that finds you that card from the Middle East. And I'm like, good luck. Yeah. But yeah, no, it would be a lot of fun just to have that as a kind of like a sport card tourism.
Because first of all, I cannot plan a vacation, and this makes me a terrible parent, husband. I cannot plan a vacation without figuring out how to tie baseball cards or baseball into my trip somehow.
That's awesome.
It is both awesome, and I've been married 20 years, and I should be better than this, and I'm not. I'm really not, Cindy. I'm like a mediocre husband. So no, but it's true. It's fun. Like, there's nothing more fun than the discovery. Yeah. All kidding aside, my wife loves when we'll pull off, into a flea market or an antique market, and just who knows what we'll find. And I got to tell you, I am now going to be looking for something that I probably hadn't thought about looking for, because like you said, when they come from advertising, they can come from anywhere. Yeah. Somebody didn't have to go buy a pack of cards to end up with one. In fact, they didn't.
Right.
So when you have antique general stuff, I mean, I have found cards in antique bookstores all the time as bookmarks.
Oh, interesting. That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah. So I always flip the pages, actually. Sometimes you got to kill time, but
but that's what makes things really interesting. Like, sometimes people ask, well, why are cards special? Why is it different than postcards or other forms of ephemera? And my response is, it's because of the purpose of why they were put on the card. And they're put on the card to sell a product. And to get more cards, you had to buy more product. And so they were really careful about what they were putting on to represent their company, excuse me. And so that's what makes them different from other forms of ephemera than posters or other things.
But from what I gather, and you're like me, what the cool ones are the ones who took a chance and maybe did something different or did something that nobody else had done before. And maybe it worked and maybe it didn't.
Yeah.
But it's not the most common thing out there.
Yeah, and I think that's why women's cards are probably produced in less quantity to start with. But if they're largely being collected by boys, young men, back then, they probably tossed the women because maybe they weren't interested. I mean, it's really hard to guess what happened, but obviously a lot of them were kept and protected, and that's why we still have them today. Thank goodness.
Well, I mean, thank goodness. So I hate to put you on the spot, and this is my mother has come out with her second book, and I was told to never ask this. Any idea when the book's coming?
I'm actually in the process right now of trying to secure a publisher. So I have a literary agent that's interested, and we just have to follow through with the negotiations. So it's hard to predict that time. I'm hoping within a year or two. So we'll see. I'm still researching, and again, part of the challenge is every time I find a new card, and now I am trying to focus on particularly this 20s and 30s era. It adds to it. And it's a curated book, of course. It's not going to be a book of 1,700 cards, but yeah, so I'm hoping within a year or two would be really nice.
Well, I look forward to being one of the first people to place an order. I hope you will come back again and again and again and again because you are one of my favorite people.
Oh, well, love to. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share this world of women's vintage cards with your.
I realize I'm listening to everything I did. Not one banner, not one thing. This was me on the edge of my seat having fun.
That's great. That's great.
Thank you, and I really appreciate you coming on. I'm going to say goodbye. Put you in the green room for a second.
All right.
To everybody else, I hope you had half the fun I just did with that. I have a list of questions that I did not get to. This is the problem with trying to stick to 30 minutes. It doesn't work. New policy. We're going to start going over into multi-episode portions, and I'm going to have Cindy back again because I want to get about 400 more questions answered. So definitely check her out at onhermark.com and on Instagram and as well, and fantastic information all the time. And she is literally as nice off the air as she is on the air, as you saw tonight. So as always, I don't do an outro. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good one.